Howdy here. So Steve Saylor has just written a terrific column that I must share with you. For the first time in my adult life, I've paid some attention to female basketball, and solely because of one person, Caitlin Clark. Right? She's heterosexual. Right? She's some white girl out of middle America, and she's likable, she's attractive, and she does cool things with the basketball, and she's not some thug. And why is the WNBA a completely losing organization, uninterested in dialing back the thuggishness that currently dominates the league? So Steve Saylor writes, the Caitlin Conundrum, when thuggishness damaged the appeal of the National Basketball Association around the turn of the century. So think about all the problems in the National Basketball Association with criminal behavior, with impregnating women that the basketball players aren't married to, right? Just the overall bad behavior of so many National Basketball League players. Remember how bad it was in the 70s? So I first started paying attention to the National Basketball Association in the 1970s, and it was the least appealing, and it had the least hold of the American public of the three major sports. All right. You'd even have NBA Finals games that would not even be televised live because the league was dominated by thugs who did a lot of drugs and behaved like thugs, and America was not into that. So when the thuggishness damaged the appeal of the National Basketball Association, the executive leadership took steps to rein it in. So why haven't NBA executives intervened in their women's NBA vanity project to protect their most valuable asset, rookie Caitlin Clark, right, from the racist, heterophobic violence at the hands of their black, lesbian-dominated players who have managed for 3 decades to keep the WNBA unpopular and unprofitable? So how often do you hear about heterophobia? Right? You never hear about heterophobia, right? But there's just as much proportionally heterophobia here about heterophobia as there is homophobia, right? Just as that there are plenty of Jews who don't particularly care for non-Jews, at about the same proportion as there are non-Jews who don't particularly care for Jews. But you never hear about anti-Gentilism, right? That's the hate that dare not speak its name. And you never hear about heterophobia, but it's present, right? If you got a strong homosexual identity, you're highly likely to have some fear and some negative feelings about heterosexuality and heterosexuals. Just like if you have a strong heterosexual identity, it may absolutely turn your stomach to see in a movie or a TV show, like suddenly 2 guys start kissing and embracing. I mean, for me, it just turns my stomach. I have just a visceral repulsion, not because I think the people engaged in this behavior are bad people. It's just distasteful for me because I have a heterosexual orientation and I have only ever had heterosexual sex. And the idea of sex between men is completely repulsive. That's just a function of my heterosexual identity. So too, I would not be surprised if for many homosexuals, the idea of heterosexual activity is repulsive, right? The stronger your in-group identity, the more likely you are to have negative feelings about out-groups. And just as there are plenty of white people who aren't that thrilled with black people, in fact, have some fear of black people and have some negative feelings about black people, proportionally, there are just as many black people who have those same negative feelings, right, about white people. So group identity doesn't just belong to Christians. It doesn't just belong to white people. All right, group identity is something that all groups have, and the higher your in-group identity, all right, the more likely you are to have resentment and fear and concern and distaste and disgust with out-groups. But it only ever gets described in one way, right? How often have you heard about rookie Caitlin Clark, right, suffering from racist heterophobic violence at the hands of black lesbian-dominated players, right? We're supposed to think that that sexual phobia only runs in one direction. It's just something that uniquely heterosexual people have, and the good people of the homosexual community just never experience this. But it's nonsense. All right. The executives of the WNBA and the NBA have considerable power to change their rules and how the referees interpret them to improve their product. Right? Normally boring baseball, slow-moving baseball, for example, sped up its play by 15% in 2023 by imposing a pitch clock to cut down on dawdling. Right, the game still has problems, such as excessive velocity on pitches, leading to too many injuries and strikeouts. Right, so Dodgers slugging shortstop Mookie Betts on Sunday got his hands broken by a 98-mile-per-hour fastball. So Betts is amazingly quick. Right, so you can't really say that it's his own fault he didn't get out of the way soon enough. Right, but the success of baseball's pitch clock reform is going to get people to talk about other possible changes, perhaps reducing pitch velocity. You might want to require starters to work 5 innings or miss their next start. Or why not call all pitchers hitting 100 miles per hour or faster on the radar an automatic ball? Similarly, during the 1990-1991 basketball season, to keep the 2-time defending champion Detroit Pistons from continuing to pound boringly on Chicago Bulls superstar Michael Jordan, the NBA increased the penalty for flagrant fouls. Right, this liberated Michael Jordan to win 6 titles and launched the NBA to immense global popularity. Would the NBA have been nearly as popular if it was still dominated by thugs? Of course not. And we can do this not just in basketball. Right, we can do this throughout life by penalizing thuggish behavior, sanctioning thuggish behavior, allowing people to have more freedom of association, more freedom to do what they want with their own property, so that people who act in a thuggish manner, right, receive a sufficient deterrent that they start changing their ways. Right. Michael Jordan retired in 1998, and the NBA's brutalism trend worsened. In 1999, the NBA's overall free throw shooting percentage, right, a figure that you'd think would go up over time, just as field goal kicking accuracy tends to go up in the NFL, dropped to its lowest point in the 1960s. So the players who were dominating the NBA were impressionable adolescents during the Bloods versus Crips crack war of a decade earlier, and they tended to dress like gang members off the court. Okay, what's going on with Hezbollah?
On the strategic level, that Israel could not annihilate and eliminate Hamas. Netanyahu and his supporters began casting about for another way to, quote unquote, win the war. And the way to win this war in their minds strategically is to attack Hezbollah, because they know that that's their best shot at widening the war. And
yeah, that's an interesting perspective. All right, Israel's struggling with Hamas, so it would make sense that Bibi Netanyahu would look for a war that he could win. Also, wider conflagration gives Israel more room to conduct ethnic cleansing of its unwanted Arabs in its midst, and also suck the United States into the conflict more deeply.
Bringing in the United States on their side, not just against Hezbollah, but also against Iran. And from the very beginning, the obsession with Iran dictated action that would bring Iran to war against Israel. Well, I think Mr. Netanyahu's wishes are being fulfilled right now. He's got an aircraft carrier battle group headed to the Eastern Mediterranean to support him. I don't know where the Eisenhower is or what its state is, but...
So I don't think Colonel Douglas Macgregor is some all-seeing prognosticator. He's interesting, right? He does have some useful things to say. He's not a big fan of Jews and the Jewish state. Doesn't mean that his analysis is useless.
It went into port after being damaged in some way by the Houthis, but I suspect that they could refurbish the Eisenhower, bring that back out to sea, which gives 2 carrier battle groups with the capability to contribute to Mr. Netanyahu's war. So I think right now, the one thing we can bet on very, very certainly, with great certainty, is a war with Hizballah. There's no question about it. And Hizballah says it's ready. It not only says it's ready, but it says it's going to have additional fighters show up to support them. I think they know that ultimately, when Israel goes after them, it's a war to the finish. There's no question about it. It's even worse than what we've seen, frankly, in Gaza. This is a war that the Israelis know they cannot afford to lose, which inevitably means that Iran will come into the war. Now, I don't know if the Israelis will open hostilities against Hizballah with the use of a quote-unquote tactical nuclear weapon, but I would not rule it out. They know that the Hizballah is heavily dug in, very well prepared, and has a multitude of weapons that they can hurl at Israel. It could level large parts of Haifa as well as Tel Aviv, where most of the Israelis are now concentrated.
Okay, so I think that idea that Israel's just itching to use a nuclear weapon, I don't buy that. Would Israel use a nuclear weapon if the state was being overrun and defeated against its enemy? Sure, but I don't think Israel's hoping for an opportunity to use a nuclear weapon. All right, let's get back to Steve Saylor here. The NBA reached a nadir in 2004 when the American Dream Team lost games at the Athens Olympics to Argentina, Lithuania, and Puerto Rico. Darryl Dawkins, Chocolate Thunder on the famously black Philadelphia 76ers team that lost the 1977 NBA Finals to the late Bill Walton's whiter Portland Trail Blazers, remarked that year, "The black game by itself is too chaotic and much too selfish." So this is how normal people talk all the time who love basketball. They'll talk about white guy basketball and black guy basketball. White culture places more of a premium on winning, less on self-indulgent preening and chest beating. In basketball and in civilian life, freedom without structure winds up being chaotic and destructive. And so in the fall of 2004, during the notorious Malice at the Palace brawl in suburban Detroit, a massive fight between the Pistons and the Indiana Pacers spilled into the stands. The NBA then decided to insist that their players behave like serious professionals rather than like rap stars who seem to glorify in shooting and getting shot. Right? Some people love to love and be loved. Other people love to shoot and be shot. One change was a dress code banning gang gear. Right? Dress code has a profound effect on you. The more religious the Jew, right, the more care he takes with his dress. Right? The more likely as a man he is to wear a black suit and a white shirt. Players responded by mocking the rule by dressing like bourgeois Carlton on The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Then something unexpected happened. Many of the NBA athletes realized that they liked their new uncool image. After all, to get as far as they had in life, they had to have a touch of Ernest Carlton about them. Yeah, you don't get far in life by only engaging in thuggish behavior and cynicism and preening. Right? That's not a good recipe for going far in life. So the idea of asking any particular group in the U.S., whether it's blacks or gays or Jews or Christians, to do better seems unthinkably racist today. But 2 decades ago in the NBA, it worked. Other rules were changed to advantage more skilled shooters over defensive goons. Referees were encouraged by the NBA Home Office to protect the otherworldly ectomorph Kevin Durant from the beating he no doubt would have endured a decade previously. Right, this year, healthy Durant made the All-NBA second team at age 35. NBA franchises started following baseball's front office trend by hiring quantitative geniuses out of MIT to Moneyball basketball. The nerds then kept pointing out that since 1979, the NBA had awarded 50% more points on a shot from beyond 23 feet 9 inches. So gingerly, teams started trying more three-pointers. Then boyish-looking Stephen Curry introduced a conceptual breakthrough reminiscent of baseball slugger Babe Ruth's nearly a century before. Just as Ruth became the first hitter to routinely swing for the fences in 1918 to 1920, Steph Curry realized that there was all the room in the world on the basketball court to get off undefended three-pointers. He was willing to back up to 30 feet or farther. So just as Ruth willingly traded off more strikeouts for more home runs, Curry accepted longer shots to get more open ones. Three-point revolution proved so successful, the NBA developed a nice problem. At least as viewed from the dreary perspective of 1999. Players got so good at shooting from long distances that scoring reached silly heights during the season just ended, such as in the last NBA All-Star game with its absurd final score of 211 to 186. Commissioner Adam Silver is widely rumored to have then sent a secret directive mid-season to his refs, telling them to let defenders play a little rougher without calling so many fouls against them. Right? Sports leagues adapt to changing conditions. Now, Caitlin Clark became the highest-scoring women player in NCAA history by introducing the Curry era to the women's game. It's the first time I've watched women's basketball. Right. For example, she broke the women's scoring record last February on a 35-footer. Right. At what point will Caitlin Clark's range become normal among women basketball players like home run hitting did after Babe Ruth showed it was possible, or will Clark's records remain outliers like Wilt Chamberlain's 100 points in an NBA game? All right. So Caitlin Clark's scoring success has made her the most popular female college player of all time, as she led the undertalented, mostly white University of Iowa teams to consecutive NCAA final games in front of remarkably numerous TV audiences. Right, women's sports tend to be small but upscale because most women athletes tend to be the product of two-parent homes who have strong relationships with their jockish fathers. The daughters of single moms tend to obsess over how to catch a man, while the daughters of wealthy dads who stay married to their mums want to please their fathers by excelling at what he is interested in, sports. So as Chris Rock said, as a father, you only have one job to do: keep your daughter off the pole. For example, women pole vaulters tend to be exceptionally beautiful. They tend to be girls who would normally be cheerleaders. Right? The acrobatic demands are similar, except that their dads make so much money that they can afford sizable pole vaulting runways in their backyards. The NBA, WNBA, however, is small time, brings in only 2% as much revenue as the NBA. Rookies like Clark are capped at a salary under $77,000 a year. So WNBA has a downscale athletic base that tends to be macho black women who are lesbians and like sport for its own sake, not because they want to please their dads, who they usually have not seen much of. Caitlin Clark is a typical upper middle class white woman athlete with a 6'6" boyfriend of the type that predominated the Winter Olympics. Her father is a corporate executive, as was her mother, before she became a stay-at-home mom because her husband was making enough for the whole family. Not surprisingly, other WNBA players tend to hate Caitlin Clark and try to brutalize her. More surprisingly, NBA executives haven't come to their meal ticket's aid. WNBA players tend to have more diversity Pokemon points, being women, black, and lesbian. But sports lately have been gamed by brilliant MIT grads, so the sight of low-brow players being allowed to wreck the WNBA's big chance to finally cash in is particularly curious.
Because most of the Israelis have left the south, moved further into the center, and the same thing has happened with Israelis living in the north. They've pulled out and moved further into the center, which means these are even more dangerously lucrative targets if Hezbollah responds in an all-out war against the Israelis. And they also know that there's a very high probability that if Hizballah is in a fight to the finish with the Israelis and Iran comes in, that Russia is not going to allow Iran to be destroyed by us. It will stand by Iran. And then there's something else that's very interesting. It strikes me that very few Americans are looking at Cyprus right now. Cyprus is the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean for Israel. The Greeks have made it very clear, the Greeks control half the island, that those bases will be accessible by the Israelis. Well, as soon as that occurs, I think the Turks are suddenly going to say that's unacceptable to them, especially since those bases will be used for strikes against Hizballah. Then it seems very probable that the Turks will finally dust off their equipment and decide to enter the war. And that's an incredible development that will not necessarily globalize the war, but it will certainly regionalize it in a way that we have not seen in the past.
And as Gary just tossed up there, here's almost right on cue is a headline in The Guardian that Hezbollah leader has expressly said Cyprus will be a target if it lets Israel use its territory in a conflict. And I wonder if you could explain a little bit more for some of our viewers who may not understand the direct tie to Turkey and what they may or may not do as a result.
Well, years ago in the 1960s, there was an intervention in Cyprus. The Turks actually came in and went to war to protect the Turkish population on Cyprus from the Greeks. And I think this is something that Americans should revisit and look at very carefully. We've had some measure of stability on the island, but it's another one of these open sores. It's similar to the arrangements that we've made in the Balkans. We managed to come up with an arrangement that would temporarily cause parties to cease fire, but we haven't solved anything. And the Cyprus.
So Israel looks like it's in the most desperate straits in the last 50 years, since the Yom Kippur War of 1973.
Problem has never really been solved. And so I think this is an opportunity for the Turks to come in and solve the problem in ways that they wanted to do years ago. They were prevented from it by.
So there are a lot of things that people want to do, but given the current incentives, they don't do. But if current situation changes, if current incentive changes, then people are ready to act. Nations are ready to act. We are profoundly affected by the situation, right? The situation changes and the incentives change, right? Then all sorts of things that people want to do, they will start doing, and you might not like many of them, right? So you may think your neighbor Joe is a mild-mannered, kindly guy, but in certain circumstances, he will turn your life upside down, right? Nobody is always kind and good and truthful. And so too with nations, right? There are no permanent alliances, or there are shifting interests. And so if Israel goes to war with Hezbollah, and then Turkey takes over Cyprus, and then Iran comes to the aid of Hezbollah, and then in this maelstrom, the United States intervenes on behalf of Israel, and Hezbollah is firing thousands of rockets into Israel, flattening much of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Haifa, plunging the country into darkness, right? Just destroying the electrical grid. Desperate times in Israel will lead to desperate measures, and many people high up in the Israeli government would love to take advantage of such a cataclysm to start pushing out the Arabs from the West Bank and Gaza.
Us. And the Turks at that point valued their position in NATO as so much that they wouldn't risk it in an all-out war to seize control of Cyprus. But that goes away if the Israelis move in and start using those bases. At the same time, the European Union promised Turkey that at some point it would enter the European Union, but there was never any real intention to admit the Turks to Europe. And with the mass migration of Muslims out of the Middle East and North Africa.
Yeah, shocking. Not everyone means what they say in domestic politics or international politics. And yet, when you follow the news, it tends to take people on a very literal basis.
Africa into Europe, that's even less likely now. So the bottom line is, I think the next step in this war is an all-out war on the part of Israel and Hizballah against each other. The very high probability that Iran will now move into the conflict to support its friends in southern Lebanon, because I don't think they're going to stand by and allow Israel to destroy them. That brings in Russia, and that also opens the door to Turkey. And I think the Russians will tell the Turks, if you want to move on Cyprus, we'll support you, because we understand that's a vital strategic interest for you. You don't want Cyprus to become the aircraft carrier for your enemies. And the Turks are increasingly viewing Israel as their enemy.
But so, Doug, this brings up some humongous. I mean, there's geostrategic issues that are just off the charts here, and I'm sure that you're probably going to touch on them in a second. But there's some huge prospects.
Okay, so to understand Doug Macgregor, you have to understand the incentives that he's operating under. So the more attention grabbing his pronouncements, all right, the higher his profile. So he doesn't have a conventional position as a mainstream pundit where he has to defend his credibility. So he is strongly incentivized to take, shots from long range, right? To carry on with the Caitlin Clark metaphor. And if he hits some of these shots from long range, then he looks like a genius. And if he misses, nobody will really care. Now, yeah, Europe doesn't want a dominantly Muslim nation as part of the European Union, but they're not going to come out and say that.
Of problems on the tactical and operational level for the United States. We're already into the red in some of our stockpiles of ammunition because we've been given so much to Ukraine. Now we signed a 10-year prospect.
Okay, so for all Doug Macgregor's problems, at least he's not pious. Right? There's an enormous international humanitarian law world out there where all sorts of people are doing all sorts of things that make them feel amazing and excited, but it's a terribly pious and pompous world that doesn't tend to have much of an effect on the real world. And Samuel Moyn, he's a Harvard scholar. He wrote a great book about the human rights industrial complex. I think this book came out about 2010, and he notes that people in the human rights complex and scholars of human rights and international humanitarian law, right, they approach their subject in spite of its novelty. All right, human rights as a universal concern is basically brand new from the 1960s. All right, and historians and scholars of human rights and international humanitarian law, they approach their subject the same way that church historians once approached theirs. Right, they regard the basic cause, just as church historians treated the Christian religion, as a saving truth, right? A salvific process, right? Discovered rather than made in history. And so the heroes who advance human rights in the world, just like the Christian church's apostles and saints, are treated with uncritical wonderment, hagiography, for the sake of moral imitation of those who chase the flame of international humanitarian law and human rights. It becomes the main genre. And the organizations that institutionalize human rights are treated like the early church, a fledgling but hopefully universal community of believers struggling for good in a vale of tears. If the cause fails, it is because of evil. If it succeeds, it's not by accident, but because the cause is just. Well, human rights virtually never succeed as a cause, right? So this is a movement that operates dominantly on myth, which is kind of weird, because when you're trying to make the case for a movement that is new, that is highly contingent, meaning it has no power, and whatever influence and whatever possible power it might have is highly contingent on various nation states deciding to use the human rights crusade for their own purposes. Do you know anyone who's big in human rights who comes from a right-wing background? Do you know anyone who's big in international humanitarian law who comes from a right-wing background? They overwhelmingly come from backgrounds in feminism, Marxism, communism, Leninism, anti-colonialism, right, leftism, right? They are people who become disappointed with left-wing utopian politics such as Marxism and communism, and they're seeking another utopian crusade, and it doesn't really matter to them if it makes absolutely no difference in the real world. And the way they talk about human rights is the same way that a rabbi will give a sermon in an Orthodox synagogue, where you just take it for granted that people are going to accept that the Torah came from God. And so when you say the Torah says, right, even if you're referring to some pronouncement of a rabbi 400 or 800 or 1200 years ago, or the 5 books of the Pentateuch, right, it's still attributable to God. And because this is the setting, right? You get up and you give a sermon in an Orthodox synagogue, and there's a particular pious setting where you attribute things to Torah and to God, and you talk about the great rabbis of the past and the brave parishioners of the past, the ordinary Jews who stood up for Torah, and there's just a certain piety, and there's a certain inspiration level, and so we all need to do better and work together and do one more mitzvah so that we can bring them a Mashiach and hasten the ultimate redemption. All right, but you see that same piety in the world of international humanitarian law and human rights, which is weird because these fields are so brand new. They have no real-world power aside from the possibility of self-aggrandizement. And they are so profoundly shaped by contingency, by culture, by whatever narratives are going on at the time, that you would think that if they wanted to take their cause seriously, that they would be very careful in their pronouncements, because a single overstatement has the power to ruin for the reader or the listener any possible credibility. But the international humanitarian lawyers and the human rights lawyers aren't really interested in making converts among those who think critically, right? They are only speaking to the already converted. And so they take absolutely no care with the accuracy and the clarity and describing the contingency and the contestation of their field and its highly limited real-world applicability, which is stunning, right? Because unless you buy into this utopia, right, the human rights talk, if you know anything about human rights and international humanitarian law, it seems absurd. So I'll give you an example from the real world. So let's say you have a client who has intellectual property and he wants to sell the intellectual property, right? And you're the attorney negotiating on behalf of the seller of intellectual property. The buyer may well demand some indemnification clauses so that if it turns out your intellectual property is stolen, that the buyer is off the hook for the consequences of you stealing intellectual property and then claiming it as your own. So from the seller's perspective and from the seller's legal counsel's perspective, they want to make the indemnification clauses as broad as possible, right? So in legal world, indemnification clauses are known as the nuclear bombs of clauses, right? Indemnification, one single indemnification clause can ruin your whole day. And what type of personality succeeds usually as a lawyer? Someone who can keep track of where a clause on page 17, right, means something different on page 291, right? Is that precise analytical ability is what makes for a good lawyer. And so the buyer wants to maximize the range of protection that he will get in an indemnification clause, right? And the indemnification clause says if this intellectual property turns out to be stolen and the buyer then gets sued, right, the seller has to cover up to 50% of the sales price, 100% of the sales price, right? So from a buyer's perspective, you want to make those indemnification clauses big, broad, roomy, and to have the power of nuclear bombs, right? One indemnification clause will destroy you. One indemnification clause can negate an entire life of successful entrepreneurship. Let's say that you've worked on something your entire life, and then you're getting old and you're ready to sell, and there's an intellectual property component to what you're selling, and you have steadily, honestly worked hard. You have accumulated a property that has a sales price of $50 million. But if you sign off on a careless indemnification clause, right, you'll lose all of that $50 million and even be liable for more. You can be reduced to absolute poverty and bankruptcy if your attorney is not careful with the way he negotiates an indemnification clause, right? From the buyer's perspective, he wants to make the indemnification clause as narrow as possible, as limited as possible, as specific as possible, as nailed down as possible, right? You don't want your indemnification clause being all airy-fairy. You want no wiggle room in your indemnification clauses if you are an attorney representing the seller. And so too, if you are trying to establish something brand new like human rights as a global concern, where you have no real power in the world, so the only power you have essentially is your credibility. If you're trying to develop international humanitarian law that has virtually no power in the world, but you're trying to persuade people of its virtues, right? When you're trying to make the case for something that has no real world power and seemingly no ability to punish its opponents, then your credibility is everything. And so you want to make your claims as specific as possible, as literal as possible. If your claim is contingent, you want to describe those contingencies just as if you are an attorney negotiating for a seller dealing with the buyer's insistence on indemnification clauses, right? If you want to have any credibility, right, you want to be as accurate as possible, as specific as possible, give the context as much as possible to allow as little airy-fairy, gauzy, pious rumination. Just you don't want to allow space for your claims to expand like a gas in the air, because then anyone who's a critical thinker will fail to accord you any credibility, and the only people who will join your cause are those people who don't care about what is true and don't care about what is accurate and don't care about understanding things in their time and place, and don't care about understanding the contingency that is shaping your claims. Now, let's say that you are an attorney for a seller, and let's say that you're just a mediocre attorney who has no background in intellectual property. Should you then be negotiating indemnification clauses with a top international property law firm like Skadden Arps, right? Skadden Arps has got about 800 to 1,000 top-notch, the very best intellectual property attorneys, right? But you're a personal injury attorney, and do you really want to go up against Skadden Arps on your own, negotiating indemnification clauses? No, you don't. So if you're in a brand new field of human rights and international humanitarian law, and you're coming from a tradition, you're trying to build upon a tradition of carefully drawn narratives and concepts with regard to laws of war, right? If you want to retain any credibility, right, you want to have a fealty to facts, and you don't want to overstate your points, right? You're in a whole brand new arena, and you probably don't know very much. And so when you don't know very much, you want to be particularly careful. And when you're overmatched, then you need to recognize that and get help. Otherwise, you're going to get sued for legal malpractice. Or if you're a partisan promoter of human rights or international humanitarian law, you'll just have no credibility. And so credibility is everything when you don't have any this worldly power. And international humanitarian law and human rights has virtually no this worldly power. It's just like the Christians during the first 300 years, right, when they were living in catacombs and they were hunted down and they were persecuted. And so in the real world, all right, the countries that have nuclear weapons of formidable armies, all right, they are not exactly shaking in their boots at the prospect of Human Rights Watch releasing some critique of them. So you have to know your limits, mate. And an example of someone who doesn't know his limits is Aryeh Neir, writing in the New York Review of Books, the June 6, 2024 issue. Is Israel committing genocide? I have been engaged for 6 decades in the human rights movement. So there's something about men as they get older, particularly as they pass age 40, they want more and more honor, right? They want more and more applause. They expect more and more gratitude, right? They expect more and more deference. It's just part of being a man. So just like young men are scrapping to build their kingdom 25 to 40, as men move through their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, they want more and more deference. They want to be treated like the kings that they are, if indeed they have built something. And if you don't accord someone who has an impressive track record that deference, then they're not going to be very happy with you, and they're not going to cooperate with you. So this guy, right, he's saying, give me deference, right? He's been engaged in this utopian human rights movement for 6 decades, right? But listen to the utopian things that he's saying here. I have been engaged for 6 decades in the human rights movement, which has endeavored to restore peace by enforcing international humanitarian law. So on a scale of 0 to 100, how successful has the human rights and international humanitarian law crusade been? It's been a 0 out of 100. Right? They've been endeavoring for 6 decades to restore peace, and they've done nothing, right? They've done nothing to restore peace when nation states and terrorist organizations have incentives to commit war. So can the law bring a measure of justice to the victims of Israel's and Hamas's violence? Yes, law can bring a measure of justice to the victims of Israel and Hamas's violence if that law is backed up by formidable armies. The equivalent, right, the military equivalent of an indemnification clause, right? You've got an army that's as powerful as an explosive indemnification clause, all right? You can blow up some people, but you can endeavor with your international humanitarian law and human rights to make a difference in the real world, and it's just not going to do anything, because if a nation sees that it is better off going to war and prosecuting a war, or terrorist organizations see that they're better off prosecuting a war, they're just going to keep doing that. But in the final analysis, Aryeh Neir, those in the international humanitarian law racket and in the human rights racket, they're not in it to make a difference in the real world. They're in it to feel amazing, to get the feel. So remember COVID, but I don't know if you have a wife or a sister or a mother or a girlfriend. Women loved COVID, because health is one of the few areas where women consistently know more than men. And women loved the drama of COVID, right? They loved the Sturm und Drang, the emotional turmoil, all right? Women were so happy, so enthused, at least initially during COVID. I mean, this was their time. This was their time to shine. They were going to set the standards, right? They're a lot like the international humanitarian law and human rights racket, just filled with excitement, filled with utopian schemes, filled with drama, right? These guys are going to bring peace to the world, and these guys are going to pursue justice for the victims, right? Could you get any more exciting and dramatic a crusade than pursuing peace and justice? So let me just tell you a little bit about this guy, Aryeh Ne'ir. Today, the human rights movement includes thousands of organizations around the world. That's true. Right? There are thousands of organizations around the world that are interested in astrology, right? Because it provides drama and purpose and meaning to people's lives, just like human rights, right? Among international citizen movements, only the environmental movement might be better developed. Yeah, better developed in terms of funding, in terms of numbers, in terms of access to the media, but nearly zero developed in terms of real-world effects. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, neither of which seeks or accepts government funding. Oh my God, how lofty they are, not to seek or accept government funding. Well, no 12-step program usually will take a donation over $2,000 and won't take any money from you if you're not a member of that 12-step program. But Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have offices and hundreds of research staff members in many countries. Yeah, they've got a good racket going, right? So what would happen if Human Rights Watch, went up against Putin's army, right? It'd be like the Dallas Cowboys playing football against Yeshiva University. Amnesty staff is much larger. So we're talking thousands upon thousands of employees engaged in a utopian endeavor. Over the past few decades, these organizations have created a broad awareness that there is a body of law known as international humanitarian law. So notice the dishonest way that he wants to frame this, that human rights and international humanitarian law, they've been there all along, but we just needed people to bring awareness to these things. International humanitarian law represents civilized values and regulates the conduct of combatants. And it comes from communism, comes from Marxism. Right? I don't know any significant right-wing thinkers who have made significant contributions and are highly esteemed in the world of international humanitarian law. How many human rights activists come from a right-wing background and still consider themselves right-wing? Right? I don't know any. Right? This is overwhelmingly a Marxist, communist, feminist, Leninist, anti-colonial, utopian, another left-wing utopian cause. International humanitarian law forbids such practices as indiscriminate bombing. Wow, I too forbid such practices as indiscriminate bombing. But somehow, even though I'm 58 years of age, nobody has listened to me. But as many people have listened to me and my forbidding of indiscriminate bombing as people have listened to international humanitarian lawyers and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, right? These organizations require militaries to protect civilians from harm. Well, I too require militaries to protect civilians from harm. I let Vladimir Putin know right away when he invaded Ukraine that he had to protect civilians from harm. And I had as much effect on Vladimir Putin as thousands of human rights activists. You realize that? The man who stands before you right now, I have the equal effect on Hamas, on Vladimir Putin, on China's genocide in Tibet, on all the genocides of the past 50 years, Rwanda, right? I have as much effect on these world events and curbing human cruelty as 10,000 brilliant lawyers in international humanitarian law and human rights law and thousands of researchers and activists, right? I have the equivalent effect. I have the equivalent real-world power of 20,000 well-funded, highly esteemed, highly educated, high IQ people, part of cohesive organizations, and me, just 40 here, just a bloke, just a 58-year-old bloke, screaming into the void. I have as much effect as the entire human rights and international humanitarian law industrial complex. Me, just little old me, just a simple Jew, just a bloke from Kurambong, just sharing my thoughts. I have as much effect on Vladimir Putin and those organizations and individuals that carry out genocide. I have had equal amount of effect on these people as Aryeh Ne'ir and 20,000 human rights and international humanitarian lawyers. But I don't want credit. I mean, I don't need your super chats, right? You don't need to offer your body to me. Right? I'm just a simple Jew. All I want is lead a simple life following God's commandments. So here's Aryeh Ne'ir. Some principles of international humanitarian law have ancient roots, right? Such measly, such dishonest wording. All right. Yeah, literally true. But he's trying to tie in international humanitarian law to any laws of war down through history. But international humanitarian law is its own thing. It's its own development. And you got to read the work of Amanda Alexander at Australian Catholic University in Australia. She's just done some amazing scholarship on these things to just be accurate, to note the feminist influence on this, the anti-colonial influence on this, the Leninist influence on this, the communist influence on this, how the narratives keep changing, how the claims are made frequently without much regard for facts. And I'm rereading her terrific essay on short history of humanitarian law. So it really took off in the late 1990s. Right? The international legal community became focused on ethnic conflicts in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and the attempts of the newly functional UN Security Council to respond to these events. Yay, the United States, along with NATO, they crushed Serbia. Wasn't that magnificent? Just crushed Serbia, and they went and fought on behalf of Muslims. And Muslims were so grateful, right? They forswore partaking in any violence against the United States because they were so grateful for all the efforts that the United States and Europe took on behalf of vulnerable Muslims in the Balkans in the late 1990s. And we just forever developed Muslim goodwill. And so you had these ad hoc tribunals for Rwanda and Yugoslavia conflicts, and you had work towards an international criminal court. Now, human rights and international humanitarian law, it can bite, but only when nation states that have formidable armies and formidable economies funding formidable armed forces decide to use human rights, to use international humanitarian law for their own purposes. So just like women, will often see a guy and think, oh, this is a guy who's going to protect and provide for me, and they'll see him for his wallet, and they'll be excited, and they'll try to attach to someone who will protect and provide for her. And men will sometimes look at women and they'll just see an opportunity for sex, and they forget her full humanity, right? So too, nations that want to use international humanitarian law or human rights, right, to further their own purposes, right, they may not follow in the true spirit of human rights. They may not understand the gestalt of international humanitarian law, right? We all tend to use, right? Employees tend to use employers to get as much money as possible by doing as little work as possible. Employers tend to use employees by extracting as much work from them as possible while paying them as little money as possible, right? Guess what? People who want a job often lie during a job interview, and guess what? People who are seeking to hire someone during a job interview often don't tell the prospective employee the full score, right? So men who are dating women, women dating men are often trying to deceive each other and use each other to just get their needs met, right? So we finally had an institutional environment to enforce international humanitarian law because we had some nation states with formidable armies willing to go to bat for this new concept of international humanitarian law, right? Such as the United States and NATO countries and various states in Africa who are opposed to what was going on with the genocide in Rwanda. So for the first time, it appeared that international humanitarian law was no longer just a pseudocode. So when is international humanitarian law a pseudocode? And when is international humanitarian law no longer a pseudocode? It's no longer a pseudocode when there are nations with highly effective armed forces willing to back up and enforce international humanitarian law. Law is only as strong as the armed forces that are prepared to enforce it, right? A law that is not enforced is not a practical law. Human rights that are not enforced by a formidable armed forces are just a utopian scheme, all right? They're just a dream, all right? An explosive indemnification clause that is not litigated, that is not enforced, that is not referenced, right, has no power, right? Let's say you make a deal, you're the buyer, you've got these wonderful indemnification clauses in the contract with the seller, but then you lose the contract and your attorneys lose the contract. You have no access to the contract, and you miss statute of limitations. Well, you still got an indemnification clause on the books, right? You have beautiful writings about human rights on the books, right? If you've been screwed over in business, if someone tripped you and broke your back and inflicted permanent lifelong damages on you that would be worth, in a normal legal proceeding of a good solid personal injury attorney in Southern California, you'd be set for making $1 million verdict, right? Means nothing if you miss the statute of limitations. Means nothing if your attorney is incompetent, right? You're going to get much less money if your jury is in the San Fernando Valley as opposed to being in downtown Los Angeles, right? A blacker jury will give you more money than a whiter jury. So law isn't just what's on the books, right? The meaning of law is who enforces it and how rigorously do they enforce it, and who exactly enforces international humanitarian law. Only certain nation states at certain times and places under certain contingent conditions when they see it as being in the best interests of their state and whatever coalition they want to create. So just having laws on the books doesn't mean a whole heck of a lot, right? The Bible says all sorts of things that religious people don't follow. I converted to Orthodox Judaism, got a secret to share with you. Most Orthodox Jews do not perfectly observe Orthodox Jewish law. Most religious people do not perfectly observe their religion, right? People pick and choose overwhelmingly. And all the laws on the books in a religion, right, it's not going to coerce behavior if there's no communal sanction, right? If there is a communal sanction to violating Torah law publicly, then to belong to that community, you will have to avoid deliberately, provocatively violating law that your community holds sacred if you want to stay in the good graces of your community. Otherwise, you're very likely to be exiled. All right, if you go to Young Israel Century City and you drive on the Sabbath, it's very likely that a rabbi will pull you aside and say, you should not do that. And if you persist in doing it, you're very likely to be shown the door. Right? Depending on the context. If you're someone who's not pretending to be observant, that's a different category. But if you're someone who does pretend to be observant, and then you're editing porn movies, right, and that knowledge gets out, or you're engaged in very shady businesses practices, right, many modern Orthodox synagogues will kick you out. So humanitarian law, when you have an army to enforce it, is no longer a pseudocode. Now, pseudocode or real code, international humanitarian law became a real option for study, research, and work. It was exciting, right? COVID was exciting, particularly for many women, particularly in the beginning, because this was an area where they knew more than men. They were more interested in men, and it just stirred up all sorts of dramatic emotions in women that men were largely immune to, just as sports tends to evoke intense emotions in men that women are typically immune to. Men love to fight. Men love to compete. Men love to go to war, right? Men start competing at a very early age when men are boys and they're designing games to compete with other boys, right? They always design rules. So men are used to competition with rules, which is how the laws of war used to operate. Then human rights and international humanitarian law came along as a much more feminist, nurturing endeavor. And women do not like competition by and large. They do not like having whole sets of laws to abide by, right? They prefer a more democratic, kind of egalitarian, let's figure things out together sense, right? Men respect hierarchy, right? Women tend not to like hierarchy, right? Men respect law, men respect rules, men respect protocols, men respect hierarchy, men respect the laws of war and the laws of competition. These are all natural masculine impulses because men are just naturally much more physically aggressive than women. Men have at least 10 times the murder rate of women. Right? If I told you that I got beat up the other day, right, the odds are 98% that the person who beat me up was a man. Right? There are not many women who could beat me up. I've never dated a woman who was physically stronger than me. Right? And in all likelihood, you have never dated a woman who is physically stronger than you. So men are more competitive, more physically aggressive. And what keeps this in check is that they respond to hierarchy and to rules and to laws. Right? Women don't like competition. When they're thrust into competition, they react badly, and they don't tend to observe many rules regarding a competition. So that's why women will often fight in a much more dirty way, such as after a divorce or after a breakup of a relationship. So let me tell you, two people were together, and after 3 months, right, one of them decided to call it quits. Right? If I told you that one party then went on a jihad to ruin the life of the person who no longer wanted to date that person, right, would you be shocked if it was a woman? Right? I have had women just try to ruin my life simply because I no longer wanted to date them. I have male friends who've had women do everything they could to ruin their life simply because the guy did not want to date them. I know it happens, but it's much rarer that a man who gets dumped by a woman then dedicates himself to ruining her life, because almost all men would regard such a man as unmanly. Part of being a man is providing and protecting for a spouse and a family, and a certain stoicism, right? That you would fall apart and engage in such petty dramatics, right, would strike most men as unmanly, weak, womanly behavior. So it's not that men are superior or women are superior, right? Different sexes have different gifts. Right? Men respect rules regarding competition. Women tend to hate competition and tend to, fight dirty often in battles with men that men would never consider. So humanitarian law and human rights becomes overwhelmingly much more feminine, Marxist, Leninist, communist, left-wing utopian scheme. And name me the major right-wingers who are still right-wing, who are major forces in either human rights or international humanitarian law. I'm unaware of any, right? Laws of war. Virtually all the leading scholars and proponents and practitioners of the laws of war were men. But international humanitarian law is a much more womanly endeavor. It's exciting, it's dramatic, like the beginning of COVID. It responds more to the person, male or female, who's interested in nurturing. I grew up a Seventh-day Adventist. Seventh-day Adventists are incredibly nurturing. The church is also 70% women. So the third of the church that is men, they have still taken up many of these womanly, nurturing outlooks and practices in life. Seventh-day Adventism is one of those rare Western religions that was substantially founded by a woman, Ellen G. White. So human rights, international humanitarian law is an exciting, dramatic, emotional, feminine, communist, Marxist, Leninist pursuit. And so you have a new cohort of academics entering international law and start producing a large body of literature. So what are the dynamics when you have a female-dominated department or a female-dominated business or group or club? Right? It tends to act in an ostensibly democratic, egalitarian fashion, but it tends to be highly cliquey, right? The organization ceases to be so much about obeying certain rules and observing a hierarchy, which is much more of a male tendency. Instead, it's about fitting in with the cool girls and staying on good terms with everyone. And if you're a man and you wanted to put a negative spin on this, you'd call these female-dominated departments covens, right? That's a male put-down. But they have a different organizational structure and they operate differently than male-dominated arenas. So think about the difference between departments of education and departments of economics, right? Economics is one of the last bastions of masculinity in the social sciences. So you've got a large body of literature coming out of an increasingly feminist and Marxist-dominated arena. And it's completely different to the skeptical and pessimistic and masculine work of the early 1990s, which was dominated by male military lawyers and a male military perspective. Right? Name me the greatest female generals in history. There have been some, but for every one great female general, there have been at least 10 or 20 or 50 great male generals. If you were to list the 50 greatest male generals, the 50 greatest generals in history, not one would be a woman. If you were to list the 1,000 greatest Talmudic scholars in history, not one would be a woman. If you were to name the top 100 Talmud scholars right now, not one would be a woman. If you were to name the top 50 scholars of the laws of war, I don't think one would be a woman. Right? If one was, all right, you'd have 1 or 2 out of 50. All right. If you were to name the top 100 military strategists in history, all 100 would be men. Right? So military strategy, military lawyers, and the laws of war. This was a very masculine perspective that was skeptical, right, and pessimistic about the ability of the laws of war and international humanitarian law to protect civilians against the depredations of militaries who are bent primarily on achieving certain objectives, right? It was taken for granted until the 1990s that essentially militaries would pursue their objectives, and the most that could be hoped for was that in the pursuit of their objectives, they did not gratuitously attack civilians, right? That was the very best you could hope for.
To allegedly let that turn into basically a forever war. And Israel's already yelling at us. I mean, that's what Netanyahu was doing because we haven't given enough weapons here on the Hamas. Now, if they open up into Hezbollah, you're talking about a sustained combat that's going to take a lot more rockets, interceptors, artillery, all kinds of other ammunitions, which we don't have. And if you now then you spread that out over a two-front war while we're doing Ukraine, Doug, we don't have enough for that.
Well, we've not even addressed the vulnerabilities of our forces that are still sitting in the Middle East and the various bases there, which are easy for the Iranians to target. The Iranians have always exercised restraint when they saw that they were walking up to the edge. And we would do the same thing. We always walked up to the edge, but then we said no, because it's really not in the interest of the United States to be at war with Iran. Today, the problem for us is it's not just Iran, it's virtually the whole region that's turning against us. We have no interest that would bring us into war with the Muslim Arabs on the peninsula, as well as Iran, or for that matter, the Turks. We have no interest whatsoever in that. We have an interest in finding a way to stop this. But here's an important point to keep in mind, and I have to quote John Mearsheimer, who said it very, very well. If our interests and Israel's interests were actually aligned, there would be no requirement or need for an Israel lobby. Why is there an Israel lobby pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into people's campaigns and pockets on the Hill, in the House, in the Senate, and even in the White House? Because the interests do not align. So they have to be artificially constructed. And that's an artificial construct right now. And I think once the American people discover what's going on, and they'll probably discover after we begin to take losses at sea, there's going to be hell to pay in Washington. No amount of money will ultimately buy off the American electorate. The American electorate is not going to be pleased if we take heavy casualties. And I think that's a real possibility. And again, I go back to Russia doesn't have to engage directly. They can support Iran, and they can also support the Turks. And the Turks are going to be very unhappy about these developments on Cyprus. The Turks are already watching carefully to their eastern border, where the Israelis have been hard at work, as well as we, in inspiring the Kurds to attack Turkey. Why would they do that? Because that's a distraction. That diverts.
So I'm very sensitive to accusations that I'm using the works of various academics for my own purposes. I just want to share this with you. I am a humble servant of the truth. Right. I only go where the truth leads me. Right. I don't pile any agenda on top of the truth. Right. I don't even know the meaning of the word aggrandizement. Right. I don't even understand terms like egotistical, attention seeker, narcissist, self-aggrandizement. All right. I am just a humble servant of the truth. Right. The truth speaks to me. I don't know why the truth chose me as its vessel. I was just living my life. I was happy. I was banging babes. I was getting jiggy. I was getting social. All right. I was out there. All right. I was making things happen. I was doing the all in out. All right. I was just living life and loving life and just having a good old time. And then the truth called to me and it said, 40, I need you to investigate the porn industry. And I said, truth, no, it's too dirty. It's too disgusting. I've got something great going. I'm new to Los Angeles. I'm just absolutely going to town, having wonderful, wonderful social interactions, exploring, other Jewish women as we get to know each other Jewishly and learning Torah, learning love. I don't want anything to do with the pornography industry. But the truth said, 40, you must go forth and write a book on the history of the pornography industry. And then you must write a daily column on the internet about the pornography industry for 10 years, right? You must serve me for 10 years and then I will release you. And completely against my own inclinations, right? Completely against anything that was amenable to me. I was willing to take the obloquy of that obligation to the truth, right? I was willing to just go where the truth sends me, to drop all other egotistical concerns, to drop all concerns for my own reputation, for my own social standing, for my own well-being. But I just went where truth sent me. And then 2008, I pick up a book on the Alexander technique. And I just followed that to become a trained teacher, 3 years of training to become a teacher of the Alexander technique. Back in 1989, I heard the call of the Torah, right? I heard the clarion call of the Torah. Truth was talking to me. It said, 40, we need you to study Torah. We need you to practice Torah. We need you to convert to Orthodox Judaism. And I just followed the truth into Orthodox Judaism. And then, 1997, the truth said, I need you to start blogging. Books don't cut it anymore. It's a whole new world. Truth said, start blogging. And I started blogging and then started vlogging, right? And now I'm just following the truth into international humanitarian law, human rights. I'm not using the truth, right? I'm not using these concepts. I'm not using the news, right? This is me, the servant, right? I found my calling as the servant, and it's so much easier. There's just less drama. There's less self-loathing. I don't wake up at 2 a.m. concerned if I'm doing the right thing. That's really rare now. It used to happen all the time. But because I'm just a humble, unaffected, unpretentious servant of the truth, all right, I'm not using any of these concepts and academic studies and ideas and breaking news that I'm sharing with you. I'm allowing them to just flow through me in a pure, undiluted fashion, right? I'm not someone who comes into a 12-step program and go, okay, I'm going to use this 12-step program to get what I want. No, I make myself a vessel for the Almighty, for God, for truth to flow through me, and then to serve you the pure, undiluted truth, right? Without any need for partisan agenda. I'm just staying in my lane, and my lane is truth. And here I am. I can do no other. So help me God. Here I stand. I can do no other. So help me God. I must follow the truth. Okay. So international humanitarian law and human rights, right, becomes a big institutional thing, becomes a huge academic racket starting in the late 1990s. Deeply concerned with the victims of warfare and the crimes committed against them, but not so concerned that they need their work and their theorizing to make any difference in the real world, right? So if I was embarked on some do-gooder scheme, for me to sleep at night, I would need to see evidence that my scheme and my theorizing was making a difference, right? When I go down the street, sometimes I run into people who go, oh, 40, I was listening to your show, and because I heard your show, I thought maybe I should get checked out for ADHD. Maybe I should try a 12-step program for marijuana addiction. Maybe I should go to AA. Maybe I should look for a good therapist. Maybe I should call my parents who I haven't spoken to for 2 years. Like when people tell me that they've checked out my show, often they'll describe something morally upstanding and positive and beneficial to them that has come from the show, because I'm just allowing myself to follow the truth wherever it leads. Now, the people who are obsessed with human rights, international humanitarian law, right, they don't need any real world effects, right? They just need to feel something dramatic. And so the victims of landmines, right, just heartbreaking. right? So international lawyers would discuss these issues, and they would employ this new Marxist, humanitarian, feminist, nurturing vocabulary, and they became more open to human rights values in a way that their predecessors in the laws of war were not. So they believed that international law could reflect these humane, feminist, nurturing, Leninist values, right? They wrote about creating a kinder, meaning more feminine, more victim-focused form of law, a more feminine form of law, right? Men naturally orient upwards, right? Women, right, are much more nurturing and willing to look after people below them in social status, such as infants and children. And so this is beautiful on parts of both sexes. For men, it inspires them towards excellence, and for women, it inspires them towards nurturing. And yes, some men have nurturing tendencies, and they will look after people below them in status. But generally speaking, the male obsession is to focus on people who are above them in status. Men want to keep moving up in status. They really want to look upwards in hierarchy. That is the natural male orientation. Women have a natural female orientation to care for the helpless, to care for victims, right? Caring for victims, right? That gets women excited. Not many men get excited about caring for victims unless they can aggrandize them and get them laid, right? Taking care of victims, taking care of those who are helpless, right? Rescuing, right? How many men are thrilled by the idea of rescuing people who are helpless, right? Some men are, but overwhelmingly it's far more women who vibrate, who feel all good and warm and fully human and fully feminine when they are taking care of a helpless victim, right? Women respond to helpless victims in a way that men don't tend to. And this is a beautiful thing on the part of women, and it comes with dangers, just like the male orientation towards those who are above them in the hierarchy also comes with downsides. We need both men and women, and we need them in many different parts of society. 99% of kindergarten teachers are female for good reason, right? You probably need a female kindergarten teacher. So the new feminine international law was focused on creating a kinder, more victim-focused form of law. They wanted to take care of those who are helpless victims. And the idea that there was some kind of magic key, that trauma, for example, was the magic key for understanding all human misbehavior. This was highly appealing, in particular to women, and also to men with many kind of these female traits. And so those international humanitarian lawyers of a theoretical bent, they did not just resign themselves to the skeptical deconstruction that prevailed during the Gulf War. Instead, they would write from a feminist perspective, from a post-colonial perspective, from a Marxist perspective, from a warm, nurturing, let's take care of helpless victims perspective, right? And use these critical techniques, right? Critical as in critical race theory, critical gender theory, right? Critical theory, which gets attributed to the French and to what's that school that came out of Germany in the 1930s that's supposedly the repository of all that's wrong in the world today, the Frankfurt School, right? So they would use these left-wing techniques to try to look after helpless victims. And just imagine the intense, pleasurable feels that they got from doing this work, right? The feels were so amazing that they didn't need to have any real-world effect, aside from they needed a job, right? They needed status, and they needed to look cool to their peers, right? You tell someone I'm an international human rights lawyer, right? That is high status in many of the circles that I know. So they were going to transform language. They were going to transform culture. They were going to transform the world, right? Just make it filled with loving and caring. They weren't going to be like their parents were. Their innocence shone like the sun. That's a great song, American Hearts. Right, here's your typical international humanitarian lawyer or human rights activist. They were married in September back in 1969. They traveled east to India to find some peace of mind. They stood for love and freedom. They were children of their time. Whoa, whoa. They lived in a world that was cold and uncaring. They swore they would change it with loving and sharing. They'll never live like their parents have done. Their innocence shone like the sun. American hearts, human rights hearts, critical race theory hearts, international humanitarian lawyers, so filled with emotion, so easily broken, but even in the broken hearts, when they see the helpless victims before them, the heart breaks, but it breaks in such a exquisitely feels way that is just so amazing. Now they've got a family and a cottage in the hills. He's always working late to pay the mortgage and the bills, and she has trouble sleeping, so the doctor gives her pills. Whoa, whoa. Who are these strangers who used to be lovers? Now they got nothing to say to each other. Too far apart to discuss their mistakes. They have filed for divorce, and it breaks their human rights hearts. It breaks their international humanitarian law hearts. So filled with emotion, but so easily broken. Well, now that their flirtation with Marxism and communism and other left-wing utopias is over, they'll each go on living, never forgetting, but somehow forgiving. They'll care for their children, protect them with pride, and that's how their dream will survive. In human rights hearts, so filled with emotion. Oh my God, I'm about to shed a tear. Samantha Power's dreams. So they might have joined the Hare Krishnas, they might have joined some cult, or they become human rights crusaders. Such a beautiful thing.
Resources in Turkey away from potentially being used against Israel. But it's a rather silly notion because Turkey is a great power. There are 80 million Turks. They have almost inexhaustible reserves of manpower. The willingness to fight in Turkey against Israel and us is enormous. You and I talked years ago about the Turkish cinema.
Oh, mate, I forgot to tell you. There's murder on the basketball floor. I mean, what they're doing to Caitlin Clark, it's murder. There's murder on the basketball floor, but you better not kill the groove. Gonna burn this goddamn house right down. There's murder on the basketball floor, but you better not steal the moves. Murder, murder, murder. Murder.
It was turning out films
Yeah.
of Americans attacking in northern Iraq and being defeated by handfuls of Turkish troops who bravely resisted the Americans. These were sellout deals in Turkey. They were immensely popular. We don't have very many friends left in the world. We certainly don't have strategic partners that see this confluence of interest with us anymore. They see us as a catalyst for conflict.
So I don't want to sound skeptical or cynical about international humanitarian law or these great human rights activists. I mean, I want to recognize them for their contributions and their sensitivities. I don't know that there was one human rights activist who was so famous and so respected that he was simply known as Brave, Bold Sir Robin. And Brave, Bold Sir Robin, he rode forth from Camelot, and he was not afraid to die, a brave Sir Robin. He was not at all afraid to be killed in nasty ways. He was not in the least bit scared to be mashed into a pulp or to have his eyes gouged out or to have his elbows broken, to have his kneecap split, his body burned away, all his limbs hacked and mangled. Like brave, brave Sir Robin. Like, he was not afraid to have his head smashed in, not afraid to have his heart cut out, to have his liver removed, his bowels unplugged, his nostrils raped, and his bottom burned off, and his penis. All right, not afraid at all. And when danger reared its ugly head, he bravely turned his tail and fled. Yes, brave Sir Robin turned out. Gallantly, he chickened out, swiftly taking to his feet. He beat a very brave retreat. Bravest of the brave, Sir Robin. What a guy. So we had these hopes for change, for a better world, more humanitarian law, supported by legal developments in international tribunals, the success of a campaign against landmines, because you did have nation states with powerful militaries, such as the United States, signing on some of this crusade, such as in Serbia. And so the Protocol 1 of Geneva Conventions brought about in 1977 to regulate law between states. All right, it was basically dormant till the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, intervened in Kosovo 1999 on behalf of those poor, helpless victim Muslims. Well, you thought it would have been invoked, but lawyers, almost without exception, right, they would acknowledge that France, Turkey, and the US were not parties to this protocol. But then they would add, the provisions of the protocol are universally accepted as customary international law and are binding anyway. So this is the upside and the downside for living in a utopian world. So in the real world, contracts aren't binding unless you're a party to the contract. But in the world of international humanitarian law and human rights, right, contracts are binding even if your nation state explicitly rejects them. On what basis? Because of the feels. It feels so amazing to say that this contract is binding. So how did the lawyers come to such a straightforward conclusion, which was so inimical to the truth, which was so different to the debates that had taken place a decade earlier? Because these were very different lawyers, right? These were critical race theorists and critical gender theorists and Marxist, Leninist, leftist, feminist lawyers, right? That they weren't going to be limited by the facts, right? All they needed was a reference to Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. So as long as they were able to throw in a few references to Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, right, that was the basis for their conclusions. Well, these various human rights organizations say this, therefore it's binding. Now, did Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch feel constrained by the truth? Right? Did they feel constrained to reference the authority for their claims? Right? Did they feel obliged to note a source for their claims? No. They would just issue these bland utopian statements, and that became the authority for people who bought into this utopia. Right? This confirmed the status of Additional Protocol 1, right, created in 1977, regulating war between the states, explicitly rejected by the United States and France and many other nations. But the human rights activists, they wanted to usher in a beautiful new world, right? They wanted to find some peace of mind. They stood for love and freedom. They were children of their time, right? They came from a world that was cold and uncaring. They swore they would change it with loving and sharing. They'll never live like their predecessors in the laws of war had done. Their innocence shone like the sun. Their hearts, so filled with emotion, so easily broken. Yeah, they've got a family in a cottage in the hills. They're always working late to pay the mortgage and the bills, but they got a great racket, right? They've got these well-funded organizations. Right? They're making a buck, bro. How can you not respect them? They are making a buck, right? Just churning out these utopian analyses of what's going on. They're not going to be limited by patriarchal concepts of facts. They're not going to be held down by capitalist notions of reality, right? They're not going to be hidebound like their patriarchal predecessors, all concerned with authority and source and proper referencing, right? They're not going to be limited like that. Their innocence shines like the sun. They issue the most wonderful, bland statements, and they're there to issue in a messianic age of international humanitarian law, right? They know the humanitarian approach, and they expect that law will protect helpless victims. That's just how it should be. What should be is. Right, so you had the acceptance of Additional Protocol 1 is now the applicable law, even though many nation states, such as the United States, most powerful nation state in the world, reject it, right? And so Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International start writing about Kosovo, and they demonstrate a completely different understanding of the laws of war than those who wrote about the first Gulf War in 1991, right? They interpreted the principle of discrimination much more strictly, all right? Principle of discrimination in laws of war is that militaries should put an effort to discriminate between combatants and civilians. But now they narrow the class of acceptable targets and permissible weaponry. Right? Oh, you can't fight like that. Right? As for proportionality, it's no longer a permissive principle. Right? Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they report it strictly, more strictly than anything that preceded them. Right? They have no legal basis. Right? They have no basis in reality. They have no standing. But those are patriarchal notions, bro. We're post-patriarchal now. We're post-colonial. I mean, don't bother me with your colonialism and your empire thinking and your capitalist thinking with notions of authority and rules and laws and proper citation and proper authority, and that a contract to be valid requires both parties to assent to it. Bro, that is colonial thinking. That's patriarchal thinking. That's so outdated, all right, in this brave new human rights world. All right, so the new approach is that there's no military benefit that can justify a high amount of civilian casualties, right? So military campaigns, as we have known them, are now illegal. And what's more powerful than a bunch of human rights lawyers proclaiming that war is illegal? And if you start killing civilians, you have failed the test of proportionality, right? Aerial bombardment, very wrong, totally naughty. That's illegal. It's disproportionate. Any weaponry, aside from like an 18th century musket, right, is disproportionate, right? You use anything aside from precision-guided munitions, right? That's disproportionate. That's illegal. You want to destroy bridges? You want to use any infrastructure that's used by civilians? You want to interrupt their high-speed internet, bro? You want to interrupt their electricity, their access to television and to pornography, right? That's totally disproportionate, bro. Right? Any attack that does not allow the civilians to have their internet, their telly, their electricity, their access to pornography, all right? Any attack that does not put the well-being, the flourishing, right, the maximum flourishing of civilians ahead of military objectives is disproportionate. This is like child abuse, right? Child abuse as a category was unknown until the 1960s. And then a bunch of the 60s into the 70s and even into the 80s, child abuse was thought of when a parent or an adult severely beats a child or sexually molests a child. And that was the common understanding of child abuse. But that just shows how patriarchal and primitive your ideas are. Now, child abuse is anything short of creating the optimum environment for your child's flourishing. Anything that's not optimal for your child's flourishing, that's child abuse. And any conduct of war that is not optimal for the flourishing of the civilians who might be affected by the war, right, that's now illegal because you are not conducting yourself in a way that leads to maximum human flourishing. I used to attend a quite liberal synagogue, and I'd hear about human flourishing, and I've forgotten a lot of that liberal left nurturing talk, or I could be much funnier. Just imagine how funny this could be if I was really up on my liberal left talk. So you can't have military attacks anymore that do not put the human flourishing of possibly affected civilians first. It's a brave new world. Maybe we will change it with loving and caring. We're not going to live like our parents have done. Our innocence shines like the sun. American hearts.
In crisis. Everything is disintegrating that we touch.
So let's look at the tactical or even operational look for a moment, because there seems to be this assumption that we can pretty much do whatever we want to do. And if it came to Hezbollah, of course, Israel is going to win that. But Israel fought an inconclusive war in 2006. And since 2006, Hezbollah has been improving its defensive positions to make it much more difficult for Israel to attack into, which is what it would have to do. And Israel has struggled for 8 months against an enemy from the Hamas that's just kind of mixed in with the population, and inconclusive there. Can Israel, in a time-effective and cost-effective way, defeat Hezbollah And can they simultaneously fight what would then almost certainly continue to spur up in its rear area? Can they fight a two-front war?
Well, I'm tempted to say no, but I think there's a distinct possibility that the Israelis will use a tactical nuclear weapon, at least one or two, to devastate southern Lebanon. What they want to do is drive all of these people north of the Litani River, just as they want to drive the Arabs in Gaza into Egypt.
Okay, so I think he is falling for his own BS here. I don't believe that the Israelis are looking to use a tactical nuclear weapon in southern Lebanon. But found something interesting, the electronic intifada. So I've been listening to videos put out by the enemies of Israel to get a different perspective.
The Netzarim corridor, but on the northern border with the Israeli border with Lebanon, Hezbollah has been stepping up its operations, and they released statistics for their operations from the 250-day mark that just passed the other day. They showed us here, slide number 20, Tamara, is the Hezbollah quantity.
So when I listen to this electronic intifada perspective, like they often come with arguments and commentary that I've never heard before, because I live in my Zionist bubble, and it's quite challenging, right? Doesn't come easy to me to hear this contradictory perspective.
Quantitative here, assessment of their operations, 2,125 military operations. And I'll read you these operations. We can go to number 21, because Hezbollah also released a mixtape of their operations. And interestingly, just note here,
Hezbollah is the most powerful, the most dangerous non-state military actor in the world.
that this video begins with the camera lens. The camera lens, then the anti-tank missiles, and it just gives you a sense of the way that they have embedded these media ops.
Right, you look at this video and you think that Hezbollah can essentially wipe out Israel's electrical grid within an hour.
And the critical role these media operations play in this war, showing us things that the Israelis would otherwise lie about. And the way that the resistance, both in Lebanon and...
Oh my God, did he say the Israelis lie? Yeah, Israelis lie, non-Israelis lie, everyone lies, right? We're all self-deceived and intentionally trying to deceive others.
And in Gaza has used...
So one of the best ways to kind of put a limit on your lying is to confront people who hate you. Right? You'll often get a bracing, painful clarity from them that you won't get from your friends. And so what the electronic intifada offers here is a bracing, painful clarity.
Used these media operations, recording their operations and showing them to the world, is a critical part of their war-fighting strategy. These videos are made to be seen. They're made to be shown and talked about in the way that we talk about them on the air here. Some people sometimes say, are we saying too much about the operations? Is it dangerous for the fighters?
So I wonder, what would you guess is the average IQ of a Hezbollah member? So I would guess 90, 95, maybe probably 90. And so what would be the average IQ of a member of the IDF? I would expect it would to be 105.
Videos are released by the fighters themselves. That is the point of these videos, is to show them and to be seen and to see these operations. And here, this is the 250-day mixtape that Hezbollah released to just give you a sense of some of these operations. So they've targeted 304 settlements.
I mean, I've had various Sheilas give me mixtapes in my time, but wow. If I met a Sheila who gave me a mixtape like this, it would certainly grab my attention.
1,373 border sites, 89 rear sites. So those are positions beyond the border, 200 different border points, 59 aerial targeting, 110 targetings of bases, And of course, the Israelis have hundreds of thousands of people out of their northern communities in the north, just like they are in the south. The buffer zones, as we know, are inside Israel now. They're not in Lebanon like they were during the occupation of Lebanon, and they're not inside Gaza. They're in the envelope. And you can see here where this video loops again, you can see the camera. They intentionally made that shot here, and that fighter on that, he's saying to his unit, he says, Unit 24, we answer Gaza's call. So he's saying that. That's what the fighter is saying on that record, on the that video that you just saw there. When he's talking to his troops, he's talking to his unit and saying that we're answering Gaza's call, which is what Hezbollah said this has all been about since October the 8th, when they joined this battle in solidarity with the southern front in Gaza. We have shown you many of these operations. You'll recognize many of these operations I've shown you over the last 8 months and broke them down in detail, but these have been coming fast and furious over the last couple weeks. Hezbollah is definitely turning up the heat on the northern front for Israel. These are the suicide, the one-way suicide drones, kamikaze drones, attack drones that Hezbollah has been using. So
there's good reason to doubt the effectiveness of Israel's air defenses if Hezbollah's drones can get the footage that they're getting in this mixtape.
So just let me give you more of these numbers. 3 military factories, 50 artillery positions, 10 Iron Dome platforms, including 5 since day 200, 7 drones downed, 5 of their flagship drones, the Hermes 900. I'll show you that in coming up here. Another one was downed. But Hezbollah says 442 artillery operations that they have carried out, 925 surface-to-surface rocket attacks, so 925 rocket attacks. Israel says 5,000 rockets in those attacks, 82 sniper machine gun attacks, 100 drone attacks, 682 anti-tank guided missiles attacks, and 23 engineering weapons. So that's been significant all through Hezbollah's tempo, all through this war.
But Hezbollah has the rocketry and the missiles essentially to flatten anything that they want to flatten in Israel. They can flatten most of Tel Aviv, most of Jerusalem, most of Haifa. They can knock out Israel's electrical grid.
Has been to gradually escalate along with Israel and to tell Israel that they're ready for war on the north. And Israel seems to be blustering a lot recently about war in the north. But I think the military assessment at this point for their exhausted troops.
So Israel's Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu is a big talker and a big blusterer, but he tends to be quite cautious when it comes to actually going to war.
Troops can't defeat the Qassam brigades and the Palestinians in Gaza, who have been besieged for 17 years. Just the formal siege. Of course, the siege on Gaza goes back to the First Intifada.
Well, if Gaza is under siege, then 50% of that's on Egypt. But because this channel is not primarily devoted to truth, unlike myself, right? They don't want to mention that if Gaza is an open-air prison, then that's at least 50% on Egypt.
And so Hezbollah doesn't have those limitations. Hezbollah has land crossing, land access, hinterlands. They have strategic corridors between Iran to train fighters, to import weapons. All these things that Gaza doesn't have, Hezbollah does have. And so Israel taunting or saying that they're going to fight a war against Hezbollah.
This is the first time in at least 50 years that the buffer zone is inside Israel. Normally the buffer zone is in Gaza or in southern Lebanon, or is in Sinai. Right? For the first time, Israel has had to endure a buffer zone within their own territory. 100, 200,000 Israelis have had to flee from their homes.
seems to be a strategic catastrophe waiting for Israel. Let's look at number 22, because Hezbollah has also shown us the ability to down Israel's flagship drones. This is a Hermes 900, the Elbit drone. This is a $10 million per unit drone. When they sell them to foreign countries, which they've sold hundreds to foreign countries, they end up being more like $20 million in the packages because of the pilots that come with them. The pilots are from Elbit, the corporate builder of these drones. Also staffs the pilots of the drones and trains the military how to use these drones. So when you have Elbit on a boycott, divestment, and sanctions list, which they are because of their investments from foreign countries, many countries have banks, pension funds, that are all tied into Elbit, and Elbit is having these technicians actually embedded within the military units. So you can see here another Hermes 900 down. This is the second 900 down in June alone. They've downed 3 Hermes 900s and 2 Hermes 450s. So 5 of these flagship hunter-killer drones. These are attack drones that fire munitions. These are the killer drones.
This is a little bit like Al Qaeda, like releasing a mixtape of the damage that they're going to do to the United States prior to 9/11.
Drones that the Israelis are using through Gaza that you can hear all the time. And so here you see a pretty spectacularly falling from the sky. And we took the audio out. As always, we take the audio out, but the Lebanese civilians are saying, congrats, boys, you got another one. Watching from the ground in Lebanon as these drones, these Israeli drones that terrorize the region, are falling from the sky. Just very symbolic visuals that have been happening increasingly. We've reported on them from Ansar Allah too. Ansar Allah has been able to down something like half a dozen MQ-9 Reaper drones.
So in 1967, Israel won a rapid war against its enemies, but in 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, Israel was surprised, and the Egyptians fought quite effectively, and Israel was rocked, was desperate, right? Except for a massive arms shipment from the United States, right? Israel would not have survived as an independent state. So there's not some dicta from heaven that Israel always has to have the superior technology and the superior fighting force.
So it seems like the Axis of Resistance has this capability now to down these flagship drones. And we're seeing it consistently. And this is on top of these, this is a surface-to-air missile. Again, Hezbollah cuts out the part where the missile hits. They're still hiding what missile is used, but we've reported on that before. It's item 358 that is likely what is being used to take down these drones.
So Hezbollah is about 10 times more formidable than Hamas. And it's not that Israel can't defeat Hezbollah, but it will be 10 times more difficult than defeating Hamas in Gaza. And there will be probably 100 times the price paid in Israeli lives and Israeli property damage.
And if we look at number 23, Tamara, here, this is a Coronet strike. This is an Iranian version of the Soviet Coronet anti-tank guided missile, and we see it being used here on the border against an Israeli Humvee that's traveling along the border in Al-Manara in the upper Galilee. You can see the open-topped Humvee there. It's about to get hit by a Coronet, and the Israelis said that these two guys, they're only lightly wounded. They're just lightly wounded.
So Hezbollah is currently restricting itself to not attack more than about 5 miles into Israel. But if they wanted to, they can hit anywhere in Israel with missiles.
So again, doesn't seem to match the videos that we're watching. Certainly doesn't look like lightly wounded in this anti-tank missile strike on an open-topped vehicle there, but lightly wounded. You can see that there's no sides on that vehicle. It's not a fully armored vehicle. It's a Jeep. So unlikely lightly wounded in that. And then you're going to watch this tomorrow, but I'm recording this today. Hezbollah released a video of drone footage. This is pretty remarkable. They released this. This is Tuesday. They released this video. It's almost 10 minutes long. I cut it down a bit shorter, but they're showing you here drone footage over Israel. This is the Rafael Defense Systems Industrial Complex, a military industrial zone affiliate.
Hey, I want to intervene. I mean, I think that what that missile did to that Jeep, I think the missile was breaking the speed limit. And so I want to call out for human rights. You're not allowed to have projectiles that move that rapidly, right? That just violates international humanitarian law. So I'm throwing a flag, excessive speeding in that missile.
Affiliated with Rafael, a major Israeli weapons manufacturer, and includes factories, warehouses, testing areas. It includes Iron Dome platforms that we're looking at here. So we're getting
So one of the two most powerful people with regard to Israel's electricity grid essentially confessed this week that it's unprotected and highly vulnerable and can be destroyed by Hezbollah whenever Hezbollah wants to do so. Then he was forced to retract that statement, but I suspect that he simply slipped up and told the truth.
Hezbollah footage of Iron Dome platforms. You can see the military industrial complex that they're showing here of the leading Israeli defense, one of the leading Israeli defense establishments. Here we see David Sling and Iron Dome. Again, this is part of their air defense array that's designed to take down drones that are...
Right, so how is Hezbollah able to fly these drones into Israel? Clearly, Israel's air defenses are not exactly formidable.
Recording footage like this, and now they're going to show us Haifa. They're going to show us the neighborhoods in Haifa. They identified 260,000 people in these neighborhoods that they're flying over. This is Hezbollah drone footage flying over. It says high density.
Right, if Hezbollah starts unleashing 1,000 missiles, right, into any part in Israel that it wants, if it starts unleashing its arsenal, we're talking 20,000 dead Israelis in the first hour.
The urban block bordering the coast of Haifa Bay, located north of occupied, they call.
Why have 500,000 Israelis left the country since October 7? Because of things like this, right? It's not because they're crazy. They're just in the grip of completely irrational emotions, right? They're logically, coldly calculating that it's unsafe to live in Israel, and they're better off living outside of Israel.
Occupied Haifa. And again, you can see this footage, crystal clear footage of the population of 260,000 in Haifa. This is the target of a war, an open war with Hezbollah would mean. It would mean targets well within Hezbollah range, Israeli cities that haven't previously had to deal with war on the scale that the North has as well. And so this is the port of Haifa, showing you the strategic area includes large military, industrial, and commercial facilities, Haifa military base, naval base, Haifa civilian port, the largest port in Israel. And here they're going to show us the main naval stations here. Over the port of Haifa has petrochemical plants.
So before you have a war, you have to have an argument, right? Two countries do not go to war with each other if they have an accurate understanding of their own strength and the other party's strength. So wars are ways of resolving arguments. So parts of Israel's military establishment thinks that it can soundly defeat Hezbollah at an acceptable cost. They may get a nasty surprise, or Hezbollah may get the nasty surprise. Maybe Israel has all sorts of prowess that Hezbollah is not aware of. But there'll only be war between Hezbollah and Israel if at least one side has dramatically underestimated the capability of itself and of the enemy.
You can see there's lots of civilian areas integrated with military areas. According to the Israelis, this is called using human shields.
That's funny, right? That's darkly funny, because it is a big part of Hizballah, right? Pro-Israel commentary to continually talk about how Hamas uses human shields, but now the pro-Palestine crowd is using that Israeli rhetorical argument back against Israel.
All their military positions here on the shoreline, all integrated with civilian positions in this Haifa port. They're showing the submarines there, the submarine command unit. They're just flex.
And I think these are nuclear-powered submarines with nuclear weapons, right? Israel has nuclear submarines, right? Israel let Soviet Union know that it had nuclear missiles in submarines that were aimed at Moscow and major Soviet cities if the Soviet Union tried to destroy Israel.
Flexing that they know all of these sites. Here they're showing their warships. These are Corvette class warships, the Tsar warship. The Devora is a patrol boat, so they're picking out their individual military patrol boats. You can see just the boat coming in there because they're mixing their civilian and military. That's the Tsar 6. That's their state-of-the-art Corvette that they get from the Germans. Here we see the Haifa electrical station, one of the largest electrical state power stations. Chemical storage here. Nasrallah has talked about these. These are fuel tanks, storage reservoirs, oil reservoirs, strategic reserves, Israel's strategic reserves. So what we're just getting a hint at is here, they can target all their military apparatuses, but they can target their civilian apparatus and their power, their strategic reserves of oil to run their country. And an open war with Hezbollah from the north is something that Israelis are just not ready for. And this footage today from Hezbollah, this 9-minute video, is just a really remarkable video, especially for people in Lebanon.
So how bad would things have to get in Israel to use nuclear weapons? I would think they would have to fear that the very existence of the state was becoming questionable. And you can see where a furious Hezbollah missile attack that levels Haifa, levels the electricity grid, levels Jerusalem, levels Tel Aviv, levels its fuel reserve, right? Destroys the major airports, the major ports, right? You can understand then why Israel might respond in particularly strong ways.
Lebanon, who have for the last decades dealt with Israeli overflights of their territory, constantly warplanes flying over and taking violating Lebanese airspace constantly before this war. And now we're seeing Hezbollah flying a drone over and pointing out.
So what's the Armageddon clock at? Asks the chat. Decadence has decimated dedication.
All of the different strategic locations that they have to target, and this is something that is this just came out today, and the Israelis the IDF confirmed today that this is real. They told you if you needed confirmation of what your eyes are looking at, the IDF confirmed that this is of course this is real according to the IDF. And look at it, it's just remarkable that the Hezbollah drones that are supposed to be stopped by this multi-billion-dollar aerial defense array are just touring around Haifa, showing you all the major sites in Haifa, all the major positions that would become targeted in the war. And Nasrallah said in his recent speech that there's 200,000 Israelis out of their homes in the north, but he said we can make it 2 million in minutes. And that's what he's talking about. He's saying these petrochemical facilities, oil facilities, the power plant, and the Haifa airport as well here that are being shown in the port of Haifa. So this was a 10-minute video that I cut down for you, but you can see this very qualitative upgrade in the way. In the threat that Israel faces from the north that Hezbollah was showing us today. Again, this is the port footage where you can see the civilian and military.
Okay, chilling prospects if Israel goes into a full-on war with Hezbollah. Talk to you blokes later.